developed by the U.S. Marine Corps and repackaged by their D&D, and our Canadian Forces D&D folk have adapted it. And it's actually it's the same model everywhere you look. But the important piece is when you look from the injured on the right or healthy on the left, or wellness or unwellness, which is an interesting word. The idea being that we can watch these behaviors shift, and there's no judgment on the behavior in terms of who is ill. These are just behaviors that are of concern. We will say that the further to the right or into the red you go, those behaviors in any red column are what we would call depressive behaviors, as in those are the behaviors we experience when people are depressed. And one of the things we find a lot of times, especially with adult males, is if you know someone who has been relatively stable for most of their lives, and they're suddenly lashing out a lot or showing all kinds of rage issues, and especially with men, that's almost always connected to some kind of depressive episode. So it's not to be discounted as just somebody being old and cranky. Invariably it means something. So use this behavioral health piece, this mental health continuum, as your guide, and even show it to people and say, where do you think you are in this? And people will be able to see themselves for the most part. Don't ask where you think someone else is, but ask them where they think they might be. Do you think you're orange? Do you think you're yellow? If they think they're orange, one of the things we do in peer support and solution focus is say, well, rather than telling us what got you in the orange, what do you think we can do to get you in the yellow? What steps can you take that aggravate you less and can keep you in the yellow? What kind of people do you need to be around? That's part of what we do with solution focus, and it's aimed at moving people through this continuum, ideally from the right to the left. So we have kind of two levels or two kinds of stress, and we have a different approach to each as far as a peer support person goes. The type of stress that generally initiates the call for a peer support system is the acute stress, the sudden onset trauma stress. Something serious has happened in the workplace or to one of its members. People are very, very large in their experience and the way they're reacting to it. That tends to be the acute, rapid onset stuff. And the chronic is the stuff that is the grind of life. It's the coworker interaction stuff. It's the expectations at home. It's the ability to just continue to function as well as we can. So those things are kind of different, and we react differently to those things. And as I say, as peer support people, we have two different ways of dealing with it. And something that might surprise you is the number one reason people give for contacting their EFAP is relationship issues. Interesting, because relationship issues are usually indicators that a whole bunch of stuff is going on, and by the time people phone the EAP with a relationship issue, it's oftentimes at the point where somebody, one of the partners, has said, get you fixed or get you gone, and they'll reach out to try to get some help then. It's interesting to me. So as you build your activation response plan, you need to expect that there's going to be some things that are for sure going to trigger a response. We should expect it, we should see it coming, we should be monitoring it as it's happening. And in addition to what we refer to as the Big 10, the things that we know are going to cause an issue, you need to be very aware of the nature of moral injury and vicarious trauma. Moral injury is when we see a decay in society, or we have found that our value systems have been challenged to the point where we just don't know what's true or what's right anymore. A very simple and basic one is that we assume that adults protect children. We assume that grown-ups look out for little ones. And anybody that's been in the business any amount of time will tell you that that is just simply not true. So moral injury also comes from the just world theory, where good things happen to good people, and bad people eventually get theirs, and there's no reason for bad things to happen to good people. And it sometimes trips us up because it's kind of it's a well-intentioned cognitive distortion, actually, and we need to really be aware of it. So moral injury, a lot of times when those of us with trauma around children really drill down and figure it out, it comes down to a sensibility that we have that it's not natural for adults to bury children, and it interferes with our morals. So that's part of it. And the other piece is vicarious trauma. One of the things we see in dealing with veterans when they are sent to do peacekeeping missions in places that have a different social construct than they come from. Is they witness behaviors and conduct that is so upsetting and so unacceptable to them on a moral level that they can't do anything about it, because the rules of engagement is, they're not there for that. They're there to keep the peace and fire only when fired on, type of thing. And you see it a lot. Vicarious trauma injuries with people who are correspondents during civil wars, or media folk who have to go and cover stuff where they're seeing people suffering terribly and they can't do anything about it. Those are two things that you need to expect can really influence an outcome and can be just on their own, the whole thing. Vicarious trauma, moral injury, are almost separate fields of study and peer support, but it's going to be part of what you have to do. There's another underlying piece with this that we see in the public safety sector, and it seems, in my experience, to be more prevalent in the law enforcement community, is we have a thing that we call sanctuary trauma, where people get injured in the workplace by dealing with the stuff of the job, whether it's, running MVCs with fatalities, or fatals in the home, or homicides, or whatever it is that you're running. And we get injured by that and we become ill by that. And rather than the employer helping us and making sure we get the support we need to get back on track and back to contributing to the level we want to, the employer can be truly beastly in the way they treat injured workers. This is what we call sanctuary trauma, and it's very hard to unwind once you start seeing it, but it's going to be part of what you deal with as well occasionally. What we're trying to do as workplace wellness advocates is educate the workplace so that sanctuary trauma is not actually a thing. And where we sometimes see it is in returns to work. That's why a well-managed return to work that has the influence of peer folk in it can help that circumstance be less painful for the person who's returning to work. Part of what we're trying to do. So among the things we should always expect a huge response to is a line of duty death or a serious injury to a coworker or a colleague. Coming from a fire background, I'm very aware that we spend all kinds of time and money to prepare people to ensure against preventable line of duty deaths. And the Gordon Graham thing, right, is if it can be predicted, it can be prevented. So stuff we call accidents oftentimes aren't, especially if they can be predicted, because then they can be prevented. But we spend all our time and energy on preventing the line of duty death. But in North America, a fire department is more likely to have a member suicide than a line of duty death. Now, whatever business you come from, those numbers are probably going to be close to the same. That's pretty horrifying when you think of how little we tend to do to get in the way of line of duty death through suicide as well. So think about that a little bit. And the critical injury to a coworker or a colleague, that causes a lot of grief and tends to make people really shut down. Another thing that causes a massive response is the suicide of a colleague or a known person, or any kind of child suicide. It's just terrible for the whole culture. Another thing to be aware of and to really expect a huge response to is if you have a death or serious injury to a civilian as a result of operations or failed operations. One of my trucks was involved in a fatal collision with a civilian, and it was terrible. It was one of the worst scenes I was ever at, and the crowd had turned ugly on us, and I had to get the crew out of there when the crowd was really, really angry with us. And we weren't at fault. The motorist wasn't at fault. It was a technology problem, but we struck and killed a civilian, and it was just awful. And I wouldn't wish it on anybody, family or response team. Something else that can cause a big response is like natural disasters. You tend to kind of see you see the best of humanity, but you can also see some kind of societal collapse, and you can see people acting out in really strange and unhealthy ways when that sort of stuff happens. And as I mentioned, that at that moment where the crowd was really ugly with the crew, anytime your people are under extreme threat and in danger from the actions of others, whether it's terrorist threats or a bunch of angry people, it ramps up and amps up the anxiety level, and we're going to have a response to that. And here's a spot that it touches me on two levels, is the death or injury of a known person. I particularly like doing peer support work with volunteer firefighters. And the big reason for that is I have a special spot in my heart for them because they routinely run calls where they know people. As a captain on a heavy rescue truck in a big city, a city that I grew up in, I started running calls where the people on the ground were my high school friends' parents. I hated that, and that was one of the reasons I became a command chief, was that I don't want to do that anymore. And one of the teams that I trained a decade or so ago, there was an old grizzled volley who had extricated both of his children from MVCs. Like, that is as serious as it gets. And I have as I say, I have a soft spot in my heart for him, and I think that's one of the reasons why you sometimes see an attrition rate in the volunteer service that isn't really well tracked or documented, because people can just hand back their pagers, because there's all kinds of ways to contribute, helping your community without exposing yourself to that kind of second layer trauma. And something else that can, take a relatively innocuous circumstance and amp it up is excessive or wrong media coverage. There doesn't really seem to be a lot of effort in making sure media coverage is accurate. They just want to get the story out, and they'll quote the wrong people and they get the wrong facts, and you never get the right facts back. So something you could, as a peer person, encourage your folks to do is not a media blackout, but not have them watch the coverage from an event that they were at, because they're just going to get super agitated, and there's really nothing you can do to manage the messaging. And then you have the environmental aspects of a major incident. If it happens during a blackout, or you have excessive amounts of light or heat or noise, or extremes of temperature, all of those things can really aggravate people's ability to respond effectively. So let's talk about that amygdala again, because those responses we were just talking about are going to have the amygdala front and center in it. And it's going to be on all the time, and it triggers that cortisol and adrenaline and a bunch of other, hormonal releases in the body. And the adrenaline thing is really interesting, because what it does is it engorges our lung muscles with blood for a fight, and it takes the blood circulation off the skin, so that if we get into a fight, we don't get, and we get cut, we don't bleed out. What's really interesting is after the event, we typically will bleed out. And I had a case where a guy had pulled a knife on us, and he'd cut himself in a bunch of places, and it looked really weird because he should have been bleeding out, and he wasn't bleeding out of any of those spots. That was because he was so ramped up with his rage that he wasn't bleeding. It was weird. So we talked about the fight or flight thing. And it's good that people are familiar with it, but there's kind of 4 F's, which are interesting. Is that you got fight or flight, and the plus side of both of those is if you get to fight or you get to flee, you get to burn off the adrenaline and cortisol and stuff. But most of the time we freeze or can't fight or flight, and then that's when that stuff stays in our system. And that's where you need to do exercise for at least 30 minutes to push that stuff out. And if that is on a continuum where you get adrenaline rush 2 or 3 times in a day or in a shift, and you try to sleep and you can't sleep, and the next day you have it again and again and again, and you're not flowing that stuff out, that's where the long-term issues arise in terms of the wellness implications of trauma exposure and that sort of stuff. In fire, the incidence of heart issues are very high, but that is also connected to this vascular system being damaged by cortisol and adrenaline. So you actually have 4 F's, and I hope you find this interesting. So you've got fight, flight, freeze, and then the 4th F is hypersexuality, and I'll let you figure out what the F that is. We can find that really super stressed out people can become hypersexualized, and it makes no sense on the surface, but then you think about the desire to perpetuate the species when it's stressed, and it kind of becomes like some kind of Jurassic Park stuff, and it's fascinating. Another thing that you can check is, which is completely true, is that there are no more randy people than soldiers in wartime. There has to be a reason for that, and it's because of the stress response and perpetuating the species. So, as I mentioned, the amygdala is on all the time, as all the rest of your brain is on. It's assessing for threat all the time. It does friend, foe socially, and it does food, sex, environmentally, and it does advance or retreat at all times. So something to be aware of, that your amygdala's on, mine's on, it's happening all the time. Mine can be hijacked because of some of the stuff in my past. And if you want proof of that, think about this. There are whole industries dedicated to amygdala hijack, right? Look at amusement parks and thrill rides and stuff, right? Their whole thing is to make your brain, as it's rushing through space, think it's going to die. And then afterwards, people are all jangly and wow, they can't believe the ride that they went on. That was their amygdala was hijacked for a period so that they thought that they were going to die. Another aspect of this is horror movies. And some people really dig horror movies. I don't like them, but some people really like them. And that's part of the thing with that, is that they really enjoy the hijack of the amygdala and the physiological change in their body from that exposure. So the amygdala is connected to the PTSD system, and people with PTS will have triggers that are results of memories and what have you that will cause the whole body to go into that full response. So I have a couple that, I've worked through all of it, done lots of therapy and stuff. I have one trigger is the smell of stale urine in a dirty washroom, and another is a scream sound that mothers can make, but it's also a sound that little girls make when they're playing outside. It's a super high frequency thing. As a result of that, I sometimes have to leave events where, like even something as joyful as a wedding, sometimes I have to leave those if there's lots of women laughing and having a really good time, because that frequency get hit, and I get physically ill from it. I've done what I can. It's just one of the things that kind of goes with me. So the amygdala piece is something that when people have PTS, that's the triggering system for the response. We can reduce the intensity of the response. We can reduce the frequency of the response, and we can, over time, through exposure therapy, minimize the effect that triggers have on us. Because this is a bit of an aside, but when you look at how triggers affect people, it becomes kind of like the ice cream brain freeze thing, right? You eat ice cream and you get the thing, and for a while you're kind of paralyzed. You can't make good decisions. You wish you didn't do what you did. You're kind of stuck right there, and the trigger response is very much like that. So you say to yourself, you only kind of have three choices: is I'm never going to eat ice cream again because I hated that. Or I don't care about that, I like ice cream so much, I'm going to keep doing it. And the other one, which is the more sensible one, is I'm going to approach ice cream in a way that I can enjoy it as much as I can without feeling physically ill. That part is what we use in exposure therapy, so that we have small amounts of ice cream, or slightly melted ice cream, or mix it with other stuff, right? And that's how we kind of approach the whole idea of people closing themselves off, because as I said before, if isolation is depression's best friend, if you have triggers that make you gotta go and make you back away, you can have triggers from virtually anything, like going to a big grocery store, or like a big well-lit noisy place like a Walmart can be horrifying for people with PTS. Being in traffic can be terrible. Like there's all kinds of stuff that can cause us to become ill. And unless you get healthy enough through your own wellness, unless you get healthy enough to try to go after those things and try to have as much of a normal life as you can, always going to have a whole chunk of your life that's cleaved off from that. So that's part of what we're doing as peer support folk. It's also what we try to do when we're doing things like group support, because the access to safe community is the single most important part of people getting better. That's been my experience anyway. So when the amygdala is triggered, it tends to interfere with that frontal cortex executive function. Good decisions stop being made. Survival decisions start being made.